And we said there are not an infinite amount of possible worlds, but there are nearly an infinite amount of possible worlds because all it takes is one small detail in your life to have gone wrong, or I'm not sorry not to go, but to be changed that can constitute another. So everything is exactly the same except I didn't raise my hand, 20 seconds ago or whatever. So that would be another possible world. So there are these, huge amount of possible worlds out there. But if something is necessarily true, it means that there's no possible world where that is not the case. Another one is called contingently true. And contingently true means that it is true in the actual world, but it's not necessarily true in all possible worlds. And if something is logically impossible, it means that there are no possible worlds out there where that exists. So, for example, there are no possible worlds where you can have a square circle. That's just logically impossible. Okay, so contingent identity. He gives two sort of contingent identity statements. The first is that the first Postmaster General of the United States is the inventor of bifocals. And, this does seem contingently true, right? Because it seems like, in the actual world, this is true. Benjamin Franklin was both the first postmaster of the United States and he invented bifocals. But it didn't have to be the case that was true. It could have been that George Washington was the first postmaster and Thomas Jefferson was the inventor of bifocals. So yes, it is true in our world, but it's not necessarily true. It could have been different. So that's a contingent identity statement. Another contingent identity statement is Hesperus is phosphorus. And you remember that phosphorus is the evening star, I believe, and Hesperus is the morning star. Or maybe that's vice versa. I think maybe phosphorus is the morning star and Hesperus is the evening star. But anyway, the point is that in actuality, in our world, both of those terms refer to the planet Venus. But it's not necessarily the case. It could have been that Hesperus referred to Mars and phosphorus referred to Venus. So that's contingently true. But he actually wants to go a step further and say that you can actually have necessary truths that can be known a posteriori, and both of these are examples of that case. So yeah, then he goes into a discussion of what he calls rigid designators. And a rigid designator is a term that picks out the same object in all possible worlds. And he thinks that there are two types of rigid designators. One are proper names. So each individual has a rigid designator. So Eric Hodges is going to be Eric Hodges in all possible worlds. But it's all possible worlds where I exist. Of course, there are possible worlds where I don't exist. But if it's the case that I do exist in a possible world, then I'm going to be Eric Hodges. Or, what constitutes me is going to be the same. Another thing that he thinks is a rigid designator are things that are theoretical descriptions, like water is H2O and things like that. And he says that this is the case only after those theoretical descriptions have been sort of found out. So, of course, it could have been the case that the words water is H2O didn't have to be the case, but upon exploration of these concepts, we determined, that this wet thing that we have, is actually composed of two hydrogen molecules and an oxygen molecule. And when we make a statement like that, we define something in that way. We baptize it, is what he calls it. He calls it we baptize it, so that's appropriate for water, I guess. But once we baptize it, it's a rigid designator, and it applies in all possible worlds. Okay, and then he wants to kind of like disambiguate this idea of truths. And he says, there are 4 categories of truths, but he only concerns himself with 2 in this case. One is a necessary truth, which we already talked about, which is something that's true in all possible worlds. And the other is an a priori truth, which means that something can be true before actually having any experience of that thing. So we talked about things like A equals A, 2 plus 2 equals 4, things like that. Knowing that we have 2 things on one side, 2 things on the other side. If we looked at that, we would realize that those are the same. And that's innately true. So normally, people have sort of thought the only necessary truths that are actually out there are a priori truths. And Kripke wants to show that that's not actually the case. One of the examples that he gives of that is the Goldbach conjecture. And the Goldbach conjecture just says that I believe that every even number is the sum of two primes. And he says there's no way that we can know this a priori. You know, that we don't know all the even numbers that are out there, but the only way that we can figure this out is by actually empirically going through and checking every even number to see if it's composed of two prime numbers. But you know, if it's the case, then it seems like it has to be a necessary truth. Another example he gives is sort of like this idea of essences and things like that, like chairness. He talks about chairness, or he talks about, I believe the example he gives is of a lectern. And he says that the essence of the particular lectern that he's talking about is that it's composed of wood. Now, we can only know that through experience, of course, but he believes that it's necessarily the case that the essence of that lectern is that it's composed of wood and not composed of ice. So that's something that we know only after experience, but it's something that necessarily has to be the case. And this kind of goes back to like Plato's ideas of chairness and things like that. Okay, let's see. Yeah, he gives a caveat, right? He says there's an important caveat to this. Of course, there's a possible world where 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. But in that possible world, the symbols just mean different things, right? It's not that the principle of two things and two things equaling, you know, four things on this side is the same. It's not that that principle is different. It's just that the symbols 2 could mean something different. The symbol plus could mean, you know, multiplied, whatever. The symbols are different. So we have to assume when we're talking about this stuff that we're talking about our usage of the language. So it can't be, you know, this idea that the symbols could be different or whatever. But based on our language, these things are necessarily true. Yeah, I mean, and he considers this example of Hesperus and phosphorus again, and he asks the question, okay, so what does it mean to say that Hesperus does not equal phosphorus as a necessary truth? And he tries to like consider this example of how could it even be possible, considering that that Hesperus is equal to Venus and phosphorus is equal to Venus. What would it even look like to consider the fact that that's not the case, that those are identical? And he says, well, maybe what we can consider is like, you know, Hesperus is Venus in the morning, and maybe there's some sort of comet or something like that that actually moves Venus, you know, sometime at night. So what we think is in the location of where Hesperus usually is Mars, and Venus is somewhere else. And he says, no, that's not even the case. You know, once we've actually given or baptized these terms as Hesperus is the star that's in this location at this time, phosphorus is the star that's in this location at this time, then you know they're going to have those terms forever. They become rigid designators, and all it means if this comet moves it is it just means that you know something else is occupying the place of phosphorus. It's not taking the place of phosphorus, and phosphorus is just located in a different place. So essentially, you know, once we've baptized these terms or defined things in a certain way, they become rigid designators. And he also believes that they're necessary truths, but they're a posteriori necessary truths because we only know them after experience and observation and things like that. So his conclusion is that contingent identity statements are possible, and that necessary a posteriori truths are also possible. Okay? See you guys tomorrow.